good to be together this evening as we jump back into our study of the Gospel of Luke. We're on Luke chapter 19, and we come to a short man who was very eager to improve his status and being able to get a glimpse of Jesus who was passing through that way. And we see a very beautiful interaction where salvation is the result, and hopefully should be a great encouraging section of Scripture to remind us of the beauty, really, of the gospel, of what we have been privileged to be a part of if we are truly Christians, enjoying the blessings of being in the grace of Jesus Christ. And if perhaps we're in the audience here this evening and maybe struggling with perhaps sin, or struggling with faithfulness, or struggling with trying to overcome maybe regret, this is a great, really, section of how the Lord wants to deal with you and wants to help you with that. And perhaps can be an encouragement as we look at how Zaccheus was looked at by Jesus. Jesus is really converted in this section. He's brought fully back in good standing with the Lord. And if you could actually hear Zaccheus maybe talk to us, if there was a way that maybe he could try to bring this back to our minds and just kind of replay it and speak to us, probably be 3 points that maybe he'd say to us that we're just going to focus on in our lesson. Most likely he would say something to the effect of, he saw me, he welcomed me, and he saved me. These are the 3 points that really come out in this chapter we're going to look at. Let's just read it together in Luke chapter 19 and hopefully have some things that will benefit us as we study together. Luke chapter 19, beginning in verse 1. It says, "And he entered Jericho and was passing through. And there was a man called by the name of Zaccheus. He was a chief tax collector, and he was rich. Zaccheus was trying to see who Jesus was, and was unable because of the crowd, for he was small in stature. So he ran on ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree in order to see him, for he was about to pass through that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, 'Zaccheus, hurry and come down, for today I must stay at your house.' And he hurried and came down and received him gladly. When they saw it, they all began to grumble, saying, 'He has gone to be the guest of a man who is a sinner.' Zaccheus stopped and said to the Lord, 'Behold, Lord, half of my possessions I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will give back 4 times as much.' And Jesus said to him, 'Today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which was lost.'" The gospel kind of summed up in a nutshell here, this beautiful interaction with this man who has a completely changed life from his interaction with Jesus. One thing that always strikes me is the eagerness that Zaccheus has to see Jesus. And one thing that's always seems to be consistent as we read about individuals who maybe hear of Jesus going through an area and were eager to come to him, meet him, is that they've heard some things about him. And it's most likely that Zaccheus, being in the situation he is, he's a chief tax collector. He deals with tax collectors. He knows many tax collectors. That's the majority of his life is dealing in this field. And isn't it interesting that as we were just do a gradual kind of glance at the gospel of Jesus and the gospel of Luke, how many times tax collectors are the featured examples that he uses in many of his lessons? Most likely, this has gotten to the ears of many individuals, especially tax collectors. Think about you're a tax collector, okay? You're hated, you're despised. Most people look at you that you've made certain compromises in your character just to make a living. While people maybe can understand, yes, to escape extreme poverty, maybe some might be tempted to do all kinds of things to have a better living for themselves. But certainly, if you're living in Israel and you're striving to trust God and to trust that there are bigger things than money, And, of course, the idea that you're looking for a redeemer, looking for someone to save you from the oppression of the heathen Roman government and all the things associated with their idolatrous ways. You wouldn't have been looked at very favorably as a tax collector, helping these heathens occupy Israel, occupy them who had inherited this area, inherited this land, and were supposed to reign and be victorious. And here's a tax collector who's made certain compromises in his character, in his friendships, in his relationships to be rich. And what's interesting is that Jesus often, throughout his teachings, explores the area of what might be going on in the mind of someone like this. From the outside, it's easy for us to just kind of label it. We're very good at just labeling things. We label, you're either good or you're bad. You're either righteous or you're sinful. Jesus had a way of helping us understand that the complex nature of our human experience is a little bit deeper than that, which showed his sympathy and his compassion for the situations that we get ourselves in sin. And isn't it interesting, oftentimes Jesus honed in on that attitude where most likely, if you are a tax collector and you're living the good life and you have the comforts of all the money can bring, but you maybe don't feel so good about it. Maybe have regrets, maybe have guilt riddled with is this really the best thing for me? And interesting, Jesus constantly highlights it. For example, go to Luke chapter 18, just a couple chapters before, or one chapter before chapter 19. Notice how Jesus features a tax collector of all people, and he brings his attention on showing how through his remorse he was actually accepted by God because of his genuine remorse for the sins he was committing. He didn't feel good about it. He came to the Lord, came to worship, riddled with guilt, unable to look up to heaven. And in this amazing twist and turn of events where you have this Pharisee, a man who's living explicitly by the law, so careful, so cautious, and almost very confident that he would be accepted by God. And Jesus has this twist of events. And certainly, if you're a tax collector, that would have been a joy and kind of maybe even a shock to hear Jesus say that, yes, I want to tell you that if you have genuine remorse in your heart and you come to God confessing these things and seeking for his forgiveness, you are welcome in his presence. That's what he says here in Luke chapter 18, beginning in verse 9. He says he also told this parable to some people who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and viewed others with contempt. And he says 2 men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. And amazingly, it's the tax collector who goes home justified because he had genuine remorse. I don't feel good about this. I know I shouldn't be doing this. And I pray for mercy. A few chapters earlier, go to Luke chapter 15. Perhaps the most famous, the most well-known of any of Jesus' teaching. You don't have to go very far in community circles. If you just mentioned, you ever heard of the prodigal son? Most people don't even have to be regular members of any religious institution. They've heard of that. They've heard of the prodigal son. And guess who's featured? Guess who's featured as the reason why Jesus taught us? Well, look at Luke chapter 15, verse 1. What is the very reason why Jesus tells this most beautiful story of an individual who is wasting their life on prodigal living and then feels the remorse, feels the guilt, it sets in, and they want to come home and they want desperately to make things right? It is tax collectors. Tax collectors are the people Jesus is talking to say this is how God looks into their life, sees everything that's going on, and recognizes their remorse, recognizes their desire to want to come back home if possible. Because Luke 15 verse 1 says this is the audience. In Luke 15 verse 1 says, now all the tax collectors and the sinners were coming near him to listen to him. So again, if you're a tax collector and you're telling things, you're hearing things about Jesus, you wouldn't believe. He told this amazing story, and so many people's eyes were just wide open when they told this story in front of tax collectors, and wanted to encourage them, if they had a desire to hear God's word, feeling any sense of remorse for the kind of life they were living, they would be received gladly. He tells a story of a father who by all rights should have just maybe cast his son into the abyss, should have just disowned him. because of all of the things he had done. Instead, because the son felt remorse and the son wanted to come home, the father ran to him and hugged him and embraced him. If you're a tax collector, oh boy, this is perking up your attention. You would want to get a glimpse at Jesus. Could he really look at me? Does he really understand the kinds of things that I feel in that? Well, that's what he was teaching. Go to Luke chapter 5. Luke chapter 5, if you're a tax collector, undoubtedly this event would have reached your ears, that there was actually a disciple who was following Jesus who was formerly a tax collector. And this tax collector, whose name was Levi, who we know as Matthew, was not only accepted by Jesus, but he threw a reception and invited, guess who he invited? All kinds of other tax collectors. So guess what? If you're a chief tax collector, I guarantee you've heard the count of the big party thrown by the former tax collector. He said, I want you to meet the person who changed my life. I want you to meet the person who totally changed my perspective. And it was because of his generous mercy and how he sees us truly as we are, and the plight and the struggle we face of wanting to make it right. Notice it says in Luke chapter 5, verse 27, it says, after he went out and noticed a tax collector named Levi sitting in the tax booth, he said to him, follow me. And he left everything and got up and began to follow him. And then Jesus tells that Levi went and he threw this big reception, inviting all kinds of other tax collectors and sinners. And guess what Jesus did? Jesus defends the presence of those tax collectors when all the murmuring and the snide remarks are being made by the religious leaders. How could someone who claims to be so holy have anything to do with these people? And Jesus defends it. And he says, I've come to help them. A physician has no need to deal with the people who are healthy. He wants to come and reach out to the people who are sick. Imagine that if you are a tax collector and you feel riddled with guilt, you feel riddled with remorse, to hear those words, Jesus knows there's a sickness. That's why you feel so remorseful. That's why you feel so guilty. There's a sickness. And he doesn't come merely to condemn your actions. He comes to help restore you and make you healthy. He wants to help you. That is really the message that all these tax collectors were receiving as they're highlighted again and again in many of these teachings and lessons of Jesus. And one more example, go over to Matthew chapter 21. In Matthew chapter 21, a great lesson where Jesus teaches that there was a father who had two sons, and both of them were given commands to go out and work in his field. And one son said, absolutely not, I will not do it. But later he regretted it. Later he felt bad about it. He realized, maybe I should listen. I don't think I did the right thing here. He felt so bad he decided to go and change and decided to go back and work. And guess who Jesus is speaking of when he describes people who feel genuine remorse, who want to change, are gladly welcome. Who is he speaking about? Notice verse 31. Matthew 21:31. He says, which of the two did the will of his father? They said the first. Jesus said to them, truly I say to you, that the tax collectors and the prostitutes will get into the kingdom of God before you. So whenever I see this picture of Zaccheus, here's Jesus is coming through town. All kinds of people are there. He seemed to be a bit more eager than most people. Because while everybody else is there, he will not allow his shortness of stature to get in the way. It says he ran actually ahead of the crowd. He has to get the best view. He goes all the way in front of them, and then he finds a tree, climbs up in the tree because he has to see Jesus. Why? Undoubtedly, this is an individual very curious, very excited, very eager to perhaps find out for himself. Is there really somebody who actually looks at people like me like that? And it's just so encouraging when you see he has to get a glimpse. And undoubtedly, the things that Jesus had said so many times about various tax collectors, he's a tax collector. He's heard undoubtedly some of these things about the nature of Jesus and how he looks at individuals who get tangled up in sin and yet feel guilty, feel remorse, feel, I shouldn't have done that. And how does the Lord look at me when I genuinely want to make things right? And so that's where we find Zaccheus. He is a tax collector. He is a chief tax collector. He is rich. And yet he has this great desire to see one who's spoken so many loving things about tax collectors. And what's truly amazing is when he does get up into the sycamore tree. Can you imagine how exciting that must have been as Jesus is not only walking through the area, but here Zaccheus climbs up into the sycamore tree, hoping he might just get a glimpse, hoping he might just be able to get a good view, and he gets more than what he bargained for. Jesus, you can imagine maybe the heart maybe being a little bit faster. He's like 20 yards away from me. And he gets a little bit closer. And he actually walks all the way to where the tree is. He's in this and here's Zaccheus looking down. He got more than what he probably ever expected. Not only can he see him, he's having an interaction with him. And Jesus looks up at Zaccheus, and he saw him. Now I just want to pause for a moment and just think about that. What is it that Jesus saw? And why perhaps would this have been such a significant moment for Zaccheus looking at Jesus and Jesus looking at Zaccheus, and what we realize Jesus undoubtedly is seeing? Well, let's back up a little bit. Let's see what most people saw when they saw Zaccheus. Well, we back up to chapter 19, verse 1 and 2. And we have this description of Zaccheus. It says, he entered Jericho and was passing through, and there was a man called by the name of Zaccheus. Now that should be enough. That should be plenty. Here's a man. His name is Zaccheus. But we have a little bit more information. And the information given is to give us an understanding of when most people heard the name Zaccheus, they did not just say, oh, it's just one of the men who lives among us. No, this is a distinct description they would have had of him. He is a chief tax collector, and he is rich. In fact, they went even a little bit deeper than that. They won't even say his name. When people realize where Zaccheus is headed and the interaction that he has with Jesus, they decided to describe him. He's just a sinner. He's a sinner. That's all you need to know about Zaccheus. That's all you need to know about him. In other words, there's always a temptation when we see individuals in that moment, maybe caught in sin or struggling with sin, to look at just where they are in that moment. We know from the text and the things Jesus says about Zaccheus that when he saw him, he didn't just see a sinner. He saw the whole picture of his life. He was even willing to take into context and take into the picture that Zaccheus, who oddly enough his name actually means pure, had parents who were holding him as a baby, and he was innocent and he was pure just as his name suggested. Perhaps having high hopes that this baby born precious to his mother and father would one day be pure, would one day serve God, would one day be someone who honored God. That's what his name suggests from his parents. They named him Zaccheus, which means pure. But somewhere along the way, that pure soul, that pure heart became corrupted with greed, with a lust and desire for worldly possessions and status. And notice when Jesus sees him, he sees the whole picture. He doesn't just see a sinner. When Jesus, it says he looked up in the tree and he says, Zaccheus, what did he see? We'll drop down to verse 9. We see what he saw. What he saw, it says in verse 9, Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which was lost. To become lost, or to become sinful, or to become unholy, means at one time you were holy. Means at one time you were accepted by God. Means at one time you were in good standing. And so what we realize is that Jesus, when he sees a sinner like Zaccheus, he sees the whole picture. He doesn't just see him in a sinful state. He sees someone who at one time was doing the right thing, who was on the right path, who had all the intentions and all the hopes and aspirations that he would stay that way. But somewhere along the way, he became lost. And Jesus sees sinners in that condition with compassion, hoping to restore them back to a saved state. And so I believe in many ways, if Zaccheus were to tell us about this interaction with Jesus, he would have such delight to tell us. The first time I saw him, and he looks up at me and he says my name, Zaccheus. From my interactions with Jesus, what I discovered is when he saw me, he didn't just see a sinner who was a chief tax collector who was rich. He saw a pure, innocent child of God who once was serving him, who became lost. And with compassion, he wanted to restore him back to that state. And that's so important, that's so significant. Because this is why Jesus was able to have such an impact on these sinners. They sensed there's a way that he's looking at me, a way he's speaking to me that is so different from how everybody else sees me, from how everybody else perhaps labels me or describes me or talks about me. We see from the crowd, what was the crowd's response? See, Zaccheus, they didn't have any hopes for him. They didn't have any aspirations, any optimism. It was a waste. Why would Jesus have anything to do with this guy? He's a sinner. In other words, he's always going to be a sinner. He's been that way ever since we've known him, and he's probably always going to stay that way. That's not how Jesus looked at him. He looked at one who once was found, who once was safe, who somehow turned, became corrupt, became unholy, and he wants to restore him. And so from this interaction, we see this in Luke chapter 19, verse 5, this very profound moment. When Jesus comes to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zaccheus. When he says Zaccheus, he does not say Zaccheus, the sinful tax collector, but rather the man who once was named pure, who was pure, who you become lost. And I want to help you come back. I want to help you. And we see this is indicated by the way he speaks to him, not just in the name that he calls him, but what he asks him to do, what he requests of him. Not only does he say he sees him, but he also welcomes him. He welcomes him. As we see here, as we continue reading, notice, let's go back up to verse 1, Luke chapter 19, verse 1. It says, he entered Jericho and was passing through, and there was a man called by the name of Zaccheus. He was a chief tax collector, and he was rich. Zaccheus was trying to see who Jesus was and was unable because of the crowd, for he was small in stature. So he ran on ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree in order to see him, for he was about to pass through that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zaccheus, hurry and come down, for today I must stay at your house. And Zaccheus hurried and came down and received him gladly. Amazing. Not only did Jesus see someone with optimism, with hope, with compassion, but even in his state where he is notoriously despised and rejected by most of the community in terms of their status and their estimation of him, amazingly, to the astonishment of everyone else in that crowd, of all the people, Jesus wants to stay with Zaccheus. I could probably be pretty safe in saying if there was ever some special party or some special celebration, Zaccheus is not being invited to those parties. If there's ever some special moment where someone wants to invite a bunch of people to their house, Zaccheus is not on that guest list. There's no way. So can you imagine the astonishment of all these people who have also come to see Jesus, and of all the people, he welcomes Zaccheus. You're just the man I need to stay with. You come. I got to stay at your house. Receives him. And what I want to just say this point is these two demonstrations of how Jesus sees sinners and interacts with them speaks volumes of how he comes to save him. Because as Zaccheus were to tell you and I, this is my interaction. I'm going to tell you honestly, and this is what Luke says. Jesus, the first time I ever saw him, he saw me. He saw a holy individual who just kind of had the wrong path. And I admit it. I'm guilty. I shouldn't have done it. I shouldn't have done these things. But he saw someone who wrestled with that, who felt the tug of war in my mind, and the guilt and the remorse and the questioning, how do I even come back? And over everybody else that says, well, you've already made your bed. Are just going to have to stay that way. We're not going to accept you. We're not going to see that there's any hope for you. He saw someone and believed that there was a possibility for something good to happen to me. And he welcomed me. Of all the people he wanted to spend, he received me gladly. And for that, I just want to make one simple point that I find very encouraging. If there's anyone here in this audience tonight who is like Zaccheus, struggling maybe with sin, maybe feeling like Zaccheus at times and other tax collectors, I know I shouldn't have done. I know I shouldn't be doing this. If I could change it, I would, but I can't. And now, where do I go from here? Jesus sees you. He doesn't see just the sins. He sees someone with hope and promise that you can be clean, you can be restored, you can be whole again. That's how he sees you. He sees the whole picture. He sees a time in your life when you were doing the right thing. He sees the times in your life when you were on the right path. And with sympathy, he recognizes, yes, you've gone the wrong way, given in to whatever temptation overcame you. But he is not looking at you in that judgmental state of just saying, well, you know, good luck now. He wants to help. And I hope that gives you some sense of comfort to know that if you are in this audience and you have a desire to want to hear how Jesus can help you be restored, he welcomes you. He is glad you're here. He wants you to be no other place than here, and he welcomes your listening ear. He wanted Zaccheus to know that. You are welcome in my presence because I am a sympathizing high priest, is what the book of Hebrews describes Jesus as. He's one who sympathizes with our weaknesses. Now, he is going to try to make it right. But those 2 points, I believe, is what led to point number 3. As Zaccheus would say, he saw me, he welcomed me, and he saved me. He saved me. We see a total change happen in his life. Of course, it truly had to baffle the other individuals in the community that he lived there in Jericho. Probably would never have suspected anybody like Zaccheus could ever change who he was. And amazingly, he totally he repents. So we see here in verse 5, here's the response. In verse 5, it says, when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zaccheus, hurry and come down, for today I must stay at your house. And he hurried and came down and received him gladly. When they saw it, they all began to grumble, saying, he is gone to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. Zaccheus stopped and said to the Lord, behold, Lord, half of my possessions I will give to the poor, and if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will give back 4 times as much. Now, in this section, as I've read it many times and continue to look at it and just examine some of the changes in the words that are exchanged and the reactions that are given, it says in verse 8, when it says Zaccheus stopped, the way that Luke describes it is he says Zaccheus stood. It's this action of Zaccheus actually rising up and having a desire to immediately say something. My understanding, I truly believe he's in the house. As Jesus said, I want to stay at your house. What's happened is he's come down from the tree. He is now in the house, and most likely, as Jesus always said was his custom, whenever he wanted to visit with people, whenever he wanted to interact with people, he wanted to teach them. He wanted to preach. He wanted to speak about why he was there and what his purpose was. In fact, if you would go over to Mark chapter 1. Mark chapter 1 tells us that as Jesus says, anytime he had an opportunity to visit with folks, to be in towns, it was always his purpose to provide some teaching, to provide some preaching, to give them an audience where they could hear something that might benefit them. And in Mark chapter 1, notice it says in verse 38, it says Jesus is being sought out by very eager disciples, where he's staying in a particular place where lots of visitors are coming and they want to be healed by him. And Jesus is already kind of preparing to leave. And they're kind of saying, well, Jesus, why are you leaving? We got a great gig for you right here. We got tons of people who want to be healed by you. Tons of people are excited to see you. And astonishingly, he says, no, I'm ready to go. I got other places to go to because there's something that I want to do. In verse 38 of Mark 1, he said to them, let us go somewhere else to the towns nearby so that I may preach there also. For that is what I came for. So we realize Jesus didn't just happen to be in Jericho. He didn't just happen to be walking through there. He knows there's some eager audience that can benefit from something that he wants to say. He's got teaching, he's got preaching, and I truly believe that this is an opportunity where Zaccheus has undoubtedly been hearing something that we said. We don't know what's said, but we can get a gist of it. I mean, by piecing together. Go back to Luke chapter 18. Because in Luke chapter 18, Jesus specifically tells his disciples why he's going through Jericho, why he has to pass there, because he has to get to Jerusalem. Jericho is literally the last possible actual town on the way to Jerusalem. He has to pass through there. And there's a reason why he has to get to Jerusalem, and he tells them what's going to happen there. Notice in Luke chapter 18, in verse 31, it says, then he took the 12 aside and said to them, behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and all things which are written through the prophets about the Son of Man will be accomplished. For he will be handed over to the Gentiles, and will be mocked, and mistreated, and spit upon. And after they have scourged him, they will kill him. And the third day he will rise again. He is on his way to extend the greatest invitation of mercy that human, sinful mankind has ever known. Those who are wrestling with guilt, wrestling with remorse, wrestling with what do I do now? Jesus came to bring an answer and said, let that guilt fall on me. Give up the guilt. Let go of it. Trust that I want to provide a way for you to be truly healed and forgiven, but not just to remove the guilt away, but to truly change your entire existence and purpose and manner of life. Because as Jesus taught about what he would accomplish, he taught about how dying on this cross and offering up his blood would bring people into a kingdom. And in this kingdom, it's truly amazing because Jesus taught way back in Matthew chapter 6, one of the great benefits of being in the kingdom, of truly giving up a life of sin and no longer feeling that we have to depend on all the things this present temporary life has to offer. The beauty of that exchange is that when I totally trust God and his power and his love and his purpose for my life, and I've totally submitted to the terms of the gospel, he promises us and tells us, I assure you, what you will receive in the kingdom is of such value and such goodness and greatness in your life, and you can trust his provision so much, you no longer have to worry about the temporary things of life, the money, clothes, the shelter. Jesus said this is what he came to preach and tell people about the nature of this. In fact, in Matthew chapter 6, that famous passage, Matthew 6:33, but seek first the kingdom and his righteousness and what? And all these things will be added unto you. Profoundly something of this nature had to have impacted Zaccheus, because guess what? He decides to live that way. He decides, you know what? You're right. Why have I been spending my life just gathering up possessions, gathering up money, and in sinful ways? Because guess what Zaccheus says when he stood up? When he stood up, he says to Jesus, Lord, behold, half of my goods, I'm going to give them away. I don't need them anymore. And I truly feel remorse about it because I realize a lot of the ways I've gotten this great wealth is I've been dishonest, probably ripped people off, done some shady business things. And if I have, I'm ready to change. I'm ready to make it right. Listen to what he says here. Here's the nature of whatever interaction is taking place between Jesus and Zaccheus. It's hidden profoundly. And then we read in Luke chapter 19, when Zaccheus stood up, here's what he says. He says in verse 8, Behold, Lord, half of my possessions I will give to the poor. And if I've defrauded anyone of anything, I will give back 4 times as much. And Jesus says to him, Today, salvation has come to this house. And that salvation is offered for all of us here this evening. And I just want to emphasize again, in my mind, Zacchaeus does not reach out to grab a hold of this extended invitation unless these first 2 points are made clear to him. What impacted Zacchaeus to respond to the message was the compassionate way that Jesus sees him, but also speaks truthfully to him and explains to him, Zacchaeus, why are you living this way? Zacchaeus, let's talk. Let's remember the words of Isaiah. Let's reason together. Let's talk common sense. You know, there's no real need for you to continue to live this sinful life, because not only will your sins be forgiven, but you can live a much more peaceful, trusting, pure, godly life and really have so much better access to eternal riches than anything this present life can offer you. And Zacchaeus responds. And Jesus delights in it and says his amazing words of comfort. Today, salvation has come to this house because he too is the son of Abraham. How did this salvation respond? By the way Jesus saw in verse 10, For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which was lost. So if you're with us, if you are in sin, struggling with sin, feeling remorseful about sin, you're in the right place. The Lord sees you. He sees everything about you, and he sees someone who he believes is able to trust him, to let go of the guilt, but also let go of the sinful life and let go of hanging on to whatever temptations have grabbed a hold of you. He wants to offer you release from that bit. He also wants to offer to you a better life. A life that first involves trusting him, obeying him, and following him, realizing, why would I seek after everything that the world has to offer, only in the end to lose my soul? When I could go ahead and just give it all up as Zacchaeus did. Say, I truly have found salvation. True spiritual riches that are only found in Christ Jesus. So if anyone is with us, hopefully you can be encouraged by this interaction to realize this can also describe your interaction with him this evening. That as Jesus sees you in your condition, he does offer hope, he offers compassion, but he does want you to listen intently to his teaching, that yes, he sees you, he wants to save you, he wants to forgive you, because ultimately he wants to change you. And you can't change. You can put your sins behind you. You can walk without guilt. You can walk with a more promising future, trusting in the provisions that Jesus wants to offer to you. Will you come and will you confess that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and based on that confession be buried in baptism for forgiveness of life or forgiveness of sin, to walk in newness of life? And if you've done so, and perhaps like Zacchaeus have gone back into sin, Jesus is seeking to save you. Jesus wants to pull you out. Trust his words, trust his teaching, trust his direction. Once you come back to him and live faithfully again, whatever the case may be, once you come to the front, we'll assist and encourage you to obey the gospel and make your life right with God while we stand singing together.